Part 0, Episode 000. The teams arrive on the set. The first team is made up of Abraham Maslow, humanist psychologist Charles Dickens, author of fiction highlighting poverty in Victorian England, Oliver Twist, fictional poverty orphaned by Dickens. Third and fourth are Holden Ford from FBI Mindhunters serial killer unit, Johan Georg Harman from the 1780s, enigmatic philosopher known as Magus of the North. 5 and 6, Davy, Crockett, American frontiersman. Brian Wilson, lead singer of the Beach Boys, introspective musical genius, also succumbed to overuse of drugs, including psychedelics such as LSD, and suffered from eating disorders. 7 and 8. 7 is Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, German romantic of 1790s. And number 8 is Bill Tench, FBI Mindhunter serial killer unit partner to Holden. Lara Croft, Tomb Raider and adventurer.
Hell yeah! That's what I'm talking about!
James Brown, 60s soul singer.
And so, it begins.
The terrain stretched vast and surreal before them, an impossible expanse that seemed to defy normal geography. Jagged peaks rose in the distance, their silhouettes softened by a pale, shifting light that neither revealed a clear sun nor cast definite shadows. Between them lay a network of shimmering trails, each glowing faintly in a distinct color, like threads of light weaving through the land. These paths branched and looped in unpredictable patterns, leading toward unknown destinations. To the north, Lara Croft stood with James Brown, their pairing as incongruous as the land they now found themselves in. The ground beneath them was rocky and uneven, scattered with dry, brittle vegetation that crumbled at the touch. A sharp wind carried whispers, indistinct and fleeting, as if the land itself had something to say but could not form the words. James Brown bent to inspect the faint orange and olive-colored trail that shimmered before them, muttering,
"Well, at least they left us a roadmap. Question is, do we follow it or make our own way?"
Lara's gaze was sharp and searching as she scanned the horizon.
"I don't trust anything here,"
she replied, her voice clipped.
"But getting lost isn't an option. Let's see where this takes us."
Far to the southwest, Abraham Maslow stood with Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Their surroundings were gentler, but no less strange. A sprawling meadow where the grass shimmered as though coated in morning dew, despite the absence of rain. The trail before them glowed in soft mauve and pale blue, snaking its way into a dense thicket ahead. Maslow crouched to touch the ground, his fingers brushing the light.
"Remarkable,"
he murmured.
"It feels alive."
Dickens studied the looping paths with wide eyes, his curiosity tempered by a growing sense of foreboding. "Alive or not," he said, "it has the air of a riddle, one meant to test or trick. What say you, Oliver?" The boy hesitated, clutching his tattered coat tightly. "It's like nothing I've ever seen, sir. But it's better than staying here, isn't it?" To the southeast, Friedrich Schlegel stood with Tench on the edge of a barren plateau where the air felt heavy, laden with the scent of iron. The green and blue trail at their feet cut sharply across the cracked ground, disappearing into a jagged ravine ahead. Bill's jaw was set, his eyes scanning the terrain like an investigator analyzing a crime scene. "This place doesn't play by the rules," he muttered. "If we stick to the path, at least we might avoid any surprises." Schlegel tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "Avoiding surprises, yet walking into the unknown. Is that not the very definition of paradox?" Near the center of the terrain, Brian Wilson and Davy Crockett found themselves in a shifting landscape where patches of greenery bled into parched desert sands, the transitions seamless and unnatural. A red and golden orange trail glowed faintly beneath them, curling toward a grove of trees in the distance. Brian stood still, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for something familiar. "This place, it's not right. It looks like it knows we're here." Davy clapped him on the shoulder, his confidence a steady anchor. "Maybe it does," he said, "but if there's a trail, that's good enough for me. Sometimes you gotta trust your feet and go." At the center, Holden Ford and Johan Harman stood quietly, surrounded by a strange convergence of the land's features, grassy meadows giving way to jagged cliffs and shimmering lakes. The red and yellow trail before them seemed to pulse faintly, as though urging them forward. Holden frowned, his investigative instincts prickling. We're not alone here," he said, glancing at Hammond. "Do you feel it?" Hammond's serene expression didn't waver. "The land speaks in whispers, but the meaning is yours to decipher." Again. "The land speaks in whispers, but the meaning is yours to decipher. Shall we walk and see?" Each pair was bound by the same question: follow the trail or risk losing themselves in the uncharted terrain? The glowing paths offered a peculiar The glowing paths offered a peculiar reassurance, their colors a subtle promise of guidance through the vast, surreal landscape. None of them knew what lay ahead or whether they would cross paths with others. Yet the unspoken pull of the trails was undeniable, urging them forward into the unknown. Audio narration. 1.0, Episode 1, page 3 of 40. Here's a scene where these characters arrive at the zone of relief from suffering, interact with one another, and discuss their perspectives on suffering and its relief. The air in the zone of relief from suffering was lighter than the dense weight of the zone of suffering they had hurried through. James Brown and Lara Croft emerged from the dim trail, their footsteps purposeful, though each carried an air of guarded reflection. The vibrant colours of their surroundings, soft hues of green and gold, shimmering in the trees, a river of light flowing gently nearby, stood in stark contrast to the gloom they had left behind. Yet even in this place of relative serenity, an undercurrent of tension lingered. 1.1. James adjusted the collar of his shirt and surveyed the space with a sharp eye. "This here," he said, gesturing vaguely, "feels like a stage you step on after the show. Empty applause. You try to figure out what's next, yeah." Lara, scanning the environment with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, nodded but said nothing at first. Her hands rested on her belt as she studied the scene. The stillness almost unnerving to her restless nature. Finally, she muttered, "Relief from suffering seems more like a quiet trap, if you ask me." 1.3. From the opposite direction, two figures appeared. Friedrich Schlegel's quick, graceful stride contrasted with Bill Tench's deliberate, heavier pace. Both men carried the weariness of their journeys, though their demeanors couldn't have been more different. Friedrich's sharp eyes flicked over every detail, his lips curling into a contemplative smile, while Bill's stern expression bore the weight of unspoken frustration. Lara and James exchanged glances as the pair approached. James crossed his arms, his stance widening slightly, while Lara's eyes narrowed in quiet appraisal. Bill, noticing their presence, spoke first. "Bill Tench, guess we're not the only ones cutting through the hard parts to get here." Schlegel, his voice soft but tinged with curiosity, chimed in. "Hello there. The question is whether this place offers relief or simply the illusion of it." He gestured towards the strange, glowing props beginning to materialize around them. Familiar objects from each of their lives, laden with meaning and memories. A set of golf clubs, a glass of scotch, a microphone and lead singer's cape, fencing gear and mask, quill, ink, paint, canvas. Do we see these as tools to understand or or something to understand our suffering, or just distractions from it? Lara stepped forward, her sharp tone cutting through the quiet. Distractions, that's all they are. A pair of boots might remind you of the miles you've walked, but it doesn't erase the blisters. Relief doesn't come from props. James tilted his head, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Maybe so, but people need a tune to keep them going, something to make it bearable while they figure things out. There ain't no shame in a little distraction if it helps you get back up. Bill grunted in agreement, his eyes fixed on a faintly glowing notepad that had appeared at his feet. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands. It's true. People do what they can to get through the day, he said. Doesn't mean it's always the right way, but sometimes it's the only way they know. Schlegel, intrigued, stepped closer to a feathered quill that had materialized nearby. He turned to James, his tone thoughtful. Perhaps relief is neither right nor wrong. It's the meaning we ascribe to it, a melody, a page, a path. They become significant because we choose to see them that way. Lara rolled her eyes slightly, but allowed a small smile to flicker at the corner of her lips. So we're here to philosophize about props? Or are we going to figure out why we all ended up in the same place? The four of them fell into a hesitant, overlapping conversation, their perspectives coloured by their vastly different experiences. Bill spoke of societal failings and the way suffering ripples outward, harming families and communities. Friedrich countered with the idea of suffering as an existential weight tied to identity and purpose. Lara voiced the toll of physical endurance and the cost of survival, while James spoke of rising above it through passion and music, even when the odds were stacked against you. The glowing objects around them seemed to dim and brighten as their words filled the space. The zone of relief from suffering held its silence, as if waiting for them to uncover whether their beliefs would bind them together or deepen their divides. Episode 2, The Journey Deepens. Each pair begins their neutral journey, moseying along the path, encountering just subtle shifts in the landscape that reflect their current psychological or emotional state. The glowing paths continue to guide them, though some may question their direction or resist the pull. The focus of this episode will be their first encounters with manifestations of causes of suffering, drawing on their personal backstories and inner conflicts. Abraham Maslow and Charles Dickens with Oliver Twist. Abraham, Charles, and Oliver are on a neutral journey in the Southwest Territory. They walk through a serene but uncanny meadow that becomes increasingly overgrown with thorny vines. The vines begin to form shapes, figures from their past. Abraham sees echoes of his mother's stern face. Charles sees debt collectors, and Oliver sees a shadowy form resembling Fagin. Maslow begins analysing these manifestations intellectually, while Dickens grows uneasy, suspecting the vines to be traps. Oliver clings to both as his fear rises, but he also begins to question their advice, reflecting on self-reliance. They push forward as the vines fade, foreshadowing a deeper encounter with the causes of suffering. Holden Ford and Johan Harman, they are central and slightly ahead of the others, also going on a neutral journey. They cross a bridge suspended over a shimmering mirror-like river. The reflections in the water do not match reality. Instead, they show distorted, surreal images of Holden's work and Harman's writings. Holden sees an image of Ed Kemper taunting him, while Harman notices an unfinished philosophical manuscript crumbling in the reflection. The bridge begins to crack with each step they take. So I'd just like to change that. Holden sees an image of Ed Kemper inviting him to be hugged. Okay, moving on. Holden wants to confront the reflections, but Harman urges him to keep walking. Their different approaches create tension. Holden's investigative curiosity clashes with Harman's philosophical detachment. The bridge collapses as they reach the other side, forcing them to rely on each other to move forward. Davy, Crockett, and Brian Wilson. Davy and Brian are in the near center, navigating a mix of terrain. They find themselves in a dry, barren desert that occasionally bursts into color as strange oases appear and vanish. Brian becomes entranced by the oases, hearing music and seeing visions of his brothers and past concerts. Davy tries to pull him back, warning that the visions are illusions meant to mislead them. Brian's temptation to linger and indulge in the visions clashes with Davy's pragmatic instincts for survival. Their bond is tested as Davy grows frustrated with Brian's hesitation. Brian resists the pull of the illusions, guided by Davy's grounding influence. Together they leave the desert, but the tension between them lingers. Friedrich Schlegel and Bill Tench. Friedrich and Bill are advancing quickly from the Southeast Territory, entering the causes of suffering. A dense forest with paths that constantly shift and rearrange, forcing them to backtrack repeatedly. Friedrich becomes fascinated by the ever-changing paths, seeing them as a metaphor for his life's pursuit of meaning. Bill, however, grows impatient, viewing the paths as obstacles that need to be solved. Bill's practical mindset clashes with Friedrich's poetic musings. Bill accuses Friedrich of wasting time, while Friedrich suggests that the journey itself holds the answers they seek. They discover a temporary clearing where the paths stabilize, symbolizing a fragile truce between their conflicting approaches. Lara Croft and James Brown. Lara and James' home base is far to the north, isolated from the others. Now they're leaving. I can read that one again. Lara and James' home base is far to the north, isolated from the others, and now they are leaving causes of suffering, entering the terrain on the way to social reform. They traverse a rocky canyon, the walls marked with strange ancient carvings. The carvings begin to glow, projecting scenes of their past. Lara sees her parents and friends she lost, while James sees images of his youth, his mother leaving, and his rise to fame. Lara dismisses the projections as distractions, while James stops to engage with them, visibly shaken. They argue, James accusing Lara of emotional detachment, and Lara accuses James of weakness in the face of illusions. A sudden rock slide forces them to cooperate, pushing their personal struggles aside. They emerge from the canyon, but remain emotionally distant. Themes for episode 2: individual responses to suffering. Each pair begins to confront their personal struggles, whether through avoidance, confrontation, or reflection. The tensions in the partnership. The differences in how each pair handles their journey reveal underlying conflicts, forcing them to grow or adapt. Thirdly, the mystery of the terrain. The terrain itself becomes a character, reflecting and amplifying the internal struggles of those who traverse it. Episode 3: Paths Converge. As the terrain unfolds, the characters continue their neutral journeys or approach the significant zone of causes of suffering. The group become more aware of the mysterious design of the landscape, paths that loop and interweave, each marked with colors and symbols that seem to reflect their internal struggles. Questions arise. Who is guiding them? And what is the purpose of these crossings? The structure of episode 3. 1. Abraham Maslow. And his status is he's on a long, neutral journey. Setting: a tranquil, open path lined with faded carvings of figures reaching upward towards an unseen summit. Key event: Maslow pauses to contemplate the carvings, noting their resemblance to his theory of self-actualisation. He begins to sketch new diagrams in his notebook, wondering if the terrain itself is a metaphor for his own beliefs. Conflict: as he walks, he feels an unease creeping in. Are these carvings aspirations or warnings? He hesitates for the first time on his journey, questioning the balance between growth and delusion. Resolution: Maslow steadies himself, determined to follow the path, though doubt lingers at the edge of his thoughts. Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Status: they're on a neutral journey. Setting: a winding road bordered by overgrown hedges, where occasional glimpses of their destination peek through gaps in the foliage. Dickens recounts his own struggles to Oliver, pointing out moments in the landscape that remind him of his hardships as a boy. Oliver listens intently, drawing parallels to his own life. Conflict. Oliver, emboldened by Dickens' stories, begins to ask difficult questions. Why does suffering seem to repeat, sir? Do we ever escape it? Or do we just move it to others? Dickens is caught off guard and struggling to answer. Resolution. The pair press forward, finding a small serene clearing where they rest. Dickens assures Oliver that while suffering may not disappear, it can be transformed into something meaningful. 3. Holden Ford and Johan Georg Harman. Status, they're on a neutral journey. The setting, a grey, featureless plain where the horizon always feels just out of reach. Occasionally, echoes of their voices come back to them, distorted and faint. Key event. Holden grows agitated by the lack of landmarks, feeling as though they are walking in circles. Harman, unbothered, suggests that the plain is a reflection of Holden's mind, restless, always seeking control. Conflict. Holden accuses Harman of being passive and disengaged, while Harman counters that Holden's obsession with structure blinds him to the subtleties of their surroundings. Resolution. A faint glow appears on the horizon, offering them a sense of direction. Though their disagreement remains unresolved, they silently agree to follow the light. 4. Davy Crockett and Brian Wilson. Status, approaching causes of suffering. Setting, a dense thicket where the air feels heavy, and faint cries echo in the distance. Key event. Davy spots a path through the undergrowth, but Brian hesitates, sensing something ominous ahead. Davy insists they move forward, his pragmatism clashing with Brian's sensitivity. Conflict. Brian admits his fear of confronting the suffering they might face, while Davy, driven by his frontier spirit, brushes aside such concerns. Fear doesn't stop the storm, he says. It only makes you forget how to build a shelter. Resolution. They emerge into a clearing filled with fragmented memories, images of Brian's troubled family life and Davy's early losses. Both are shaken but resolve to press forward. 5. Friedrich Schlegel and Bill Tench. Status, they're on a neutral journey. Setting, a winding staircase that alternates between shadow and light with no clear beginning or end. Key event, Schlegel stops frequently to admire the play of light and shadow, philosophizing about duality and contradiction. Bill grows impatient, urging him to stay focused. Conflict. Bill accuses Schlegel of overthinking, while Schlegel critiques Bill's pragmatic, results-driven mindset. The tension grows as they struggle to agree on a pace. Resolution. The staircase levels out into a flat path, and they find a map etched into the ground. It shows 2 destinations: causes of suffering and social reform. They choose to follow the path towards causes of suffering. Lara Croft and James Brown. Status, approaching causes of suffering. Setting, a canyon where the walls are lined with relics of their past, tattered photographs, broken instruments, and faded journal pages. Key event, Lara examines the artifacts with a critical eye while James lingers, visibly moved by the memories. It's like pieces of us got stuck here, he says. Conflict. Lara insists they focus on the path ahead, but James argues that understanding the past is crucial to moving forward. The tension between their approaches to suffering comes to a head. Resolution. They find a shared artifact, a weathered compass that once belonged to Lara's father, with James's initials scratched into its side. The discovery momentarily bridges the gap between them, and they continue together. Themes for episode 3. 1. Navigating suffering. Each pair begins to grapple with the reality of their struggles, whether they choose to confront or avoid them. 2. Interpersonal tensions. Conflicting approaches to suffering. Pragmatism, idealism, avoidance, and introspection create friction within the pairs. Personal revelation. The journey forces characters to confront aspects of their pasts and beliefs, shaping how they approach the challenges ahead. Episode 4. Relief and Reflection. The preamble. The interconnected paths of the terrain begin to reveal their design. While some continue their neutral journeys, others arrive at key destinations that challenge their beliefs. The terrain itself shifts subtly as though responding to the collective movement of the travelers. A growing sense of purpose drives each pair, but questions linger. What lies at the heart of these journeys, and how are they shaping each person? Structure of episode 4. 1. Abraham Maslow. Status: still on a long neutral journey. Setting: a quiet trail through a barren landscape, punctuated by the occasional weathered stone engraved with words of encouragement and warning. Key event: Maslow reflects on his inability to find resolution, despite his understanding of self-actualization. He feels disconnected from the path's purpose. Conflict: a stone bearing the word acceptance causes him to pause, questioning whether striving for growth without pause is his flaw. Resolution: Maslow moves forward, though a new uncertainty tempers his confidence. 2. Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Status: still on a long neutral journey. Setting: a misty valley where the echoes of past conversations fill the air, distorting their understanding of the terrain. A key event: Dickens and Oliver engage in a heartfelt discussion about the nature of suffering. Oliver asks, "Is there ever a way to escape suffering? Or do we just learn to carry on? Or do we just learn to carry it?" Conflict: Dickens struggles to provide an answer, torn between his own experiences and the hope he wants to instill in Oliver. Resolution: they encounter a stone bridge that seems fragile yet sturdy enough to cross. Dickens takes Oliver's hand, leading him onward, promising, we'll find the answer together. 3. Holden Ford and Johan Georg Harman. Status: they've left social reform, moving towards relief of suffering. Setting: a dense forest where light filters unevenly, casting stark contrasts between shadow and brilliance. Key event: Holden and Harman discuss their experiences in social reform. Holden feels disillusioned by the lack of immediate results, while Harman finds solace in its ideals. Conflict: Harman accuses Holden of being too focused on outcomes, while Holden retorts that Harman avoids responsibility by clinging to abstract philosophy. Resolution: they spot a clearing ahead, where the air feels lighter. Harman smiles faintly and says, "Perhaps relief begins where urgency ends." 4. Davy Crockett and Brian Wilson. Status: arriving at relief of suffering. Setting: a vibrant meadow filled with flowing water, soft grass, and clusters of glowing flowers. The air carries a soothing hum, almost musical in its tone. Key event: Crockett stretches out on the grass, marveling at the simplicity of the space. Brian, however, hesitates, unsure if he deserves the relief offered. Conflict: Brian expresses guilt over past mistakes and questions whether he has the right to rest. Crockett responds with pragmatism, saying, "Even the hardest workers need a break. Guilt won't plant a field or clear a path." Resolution: Brian finally sits beside Crockett, allowing himself to take in the beauty of the meadow. Together they begin to feel a sense of renewal. 5. Friedrich Schlegel and Bill Tench. Status: they're on a neutral journey. Setting: a winding mountain path where the air grows thinner and the landscape becomes more austere. Key event: Schlegel, inspired by the vastness of the view, launches into a poetic soliloquy about the duality of suffering and beauty. Bill listens in silence, clearly unimpressed but unwilling to interrupt. Conflict: Bill Tench eventually snaps, saying, "Poetry won't solve a murder or fix a broken family. What are we even doing here?" Schlegel replies calmly, "You are learning what it means to be human." Resolution: though still at odds, Bill Tench and Friedrich Schlegel continue their journey, each man pondering the other's words in his own way. 6. Lara Croft and James Brown. Status: in the causes of suffering. Setting: a cavernous space filled with distorted echoes where objects from their past float just out of reach. A key event: Lara examines an artifact resembling her father's journal, while James stares at a shadowy figure that resembles his younger self. Both Lara Croft and James Brown feel the weight of their Both Lara Croft and James Brown feel the weight of their unresolved grief. Conflict: Lara Croft insists on moving forward, while James Brown argues that they need to confront their pain. Lara Croft and James Brown's clashing approaches create tension, with James Brown saying, "You can't outrun your demons, Lara. They'll just follow you." Resolution. Lara Croft and James Brown reluctantly agree to pause and examine the space around them, finding fragments of understanding in their shared vulnerability, in the causes of suffering. Themes for episode 4 to round up for all of the different characters. Relief as renewal. Characters who reach the relief of suffering zone experience moments of renewal, though not without conflict or introspection. Two, continued struggles, those on neutral journeys, on the paths that aren't really here or there yet, face inner and outer challenges that test their resilience. 3, confrontation in suffering. The causes of suffering zone demand that Lara Croft and James Brown grapple with their past, offering a space for renewal. Shut up. Again, repeat, offering a space for growth or further discord. End of episode 4. Episode 5. Episode 5, Crossroads and Confrontations. The preamble. As the paths of the 5 pairs twist and intersect, each pair finds themselves at critical junctures where the terrain challenges their beliefs and forces them to confront or embrace their journey. For some, the relief of suffering zone offers solace and insight. For others, the causes of suffering zone demand reckoning with the shadows of their past. Meanwhile, the neutral journeys grow heavier as the unyielding terrain mirrors the inner struggles of those still searching for direction. The structure of episode 5. 1. Abraham Maslow. Status. Still on a long neutral journey. The setting. A barren desert where the sky shifts between dawn and dusk, casting long, wavering shadows. Key event. Maslow finds himself frustrated by the monotony of his path. He stumbles upon a withered tree with a single flower blooming at its base. Conflict. Maslow questions whether his theories of self-actualisation have blinded him to the simplicity of small joys. Resolution. He kneels to examine the flower, pausing for the first time in days, realizing that the journey itself might hold the key to relief. 2. Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Status. Together with Abraham, they're still on a long, neutral journey. The setting. A misty glade where echoes of distant voices call out, forming snippets of forgotten memories. Key event, Oliver hears voices from his past, Fagin, Nancy, and others, whispering doubts and fears. Charles Dickens tries to shield him, but Oliver steps forward, determined to confront them. Conflict. Charles Dickens warns against dwelling on the past, but Oliver insists that understanding it is the only way forward. Resolution. Together they walk through the glade. Dickens narrating stories of resilience and redemption to counter the whispers, giving Oliver strength to continue. 3. Holden Ford, Mindhunter, and Johan Georg Harman, German Romanticism. Status, they're approaching relief of suffering zone. Setting, a windy riverbank where the water glows faintly, reflecting their silhouettes with uncanny clarity. The key event, Holden begins to open up about his doubts and fears, recounting the emotional toll of his work. Hammond listens but challenges Holden's reliance on systems and data, urging him to embrace uncertainty. Conflict. Holden Ford grows defensive, accusing Johan Harman of philosophical detachment. Johan Harman counters, saying, sometimes the answer is not in knowing, but in surrendering. Resolution. The river widens, and a glowing bridge appears ahead, marking their approach to the relief of suffering zone. Four, Davy, Crockett, and Brian Wilson. Status, deep into the relief of suffering zone. Setting, a meadow with golden light and the sound of distant, harmonious music. Key event, Davy Crockett and Brian Wilson discuss what relief means to them. Crockett, Davy Crockett, speaks of hard-earned rest, while Brian Wilson confesses that he fears losing his creative drive if he lets go of his suffering. Conflict. Brian Wilson, Beach Boys singer-writer, struggles to reconcile his identity as an artist with the peace the meadow offers, fearing it might dull his passion. Davy Crockett reassures him, saying, you can carry the fire without letting it burn you. Resolution. Brian Wilson begins to relax, allowing himself to hum softly to the meadow's melody, a tentative step toward balance. 5. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic, German mystic, romantic. And Bill Tench, FBI. Status, entering the causes of suffering zone. Setting, a shadowy cavern filled with flickering images of their past failures and past regrets. Key event, Schlegel is mesmerized by the poetic beauty of the shifting shadows, while Bill Tench is unsettled, seeing the cavern as a cruel trick. Conflict. Bill Tench accuses Friedrich Schlegel of romanticizing suffering, saying, you don't see the blood, you see the art. Friedrich Schlegel responds, "And you see only the blood, never the meaning." Resolution. Though at odds, they press forward, drawn deeper into the cavern, where their perceptions of suffering will be tested. Six, Lara Croft and James Brown. In the causes of suffering zone. Setting, a labyrinth of mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of their lives and choices. Key event. They're in the causes of suffering zone. Lara Croft is drawn to a mirror showing her childhood home, untouched by tragedy. James Brown stares into a reflection of himself on stage, surrounded by adoring fans, but visibly aged and weary. Conflict. James Brown tries to shatter his mirror, shouting, "This ain't who I am anymore." Lara Croft stops him, saying, "We can't fight what's already happened. We can only change what comes next." Resolution. Lara Croft and James Brown find a hidden path behind one of the mirrors, leading them deeper into the labyrinth, where the echoes of their past grow louder but clearer. The themes for that episode 5. One is relief as a double-edged sword. Characters in the relief of suffering zone grapple with the challenge of embracing peace without losing themselves. The duality of suffering. Those in the causes of suffering zone face mirrored truths, forcing them to reconcile the beauty and pain of their lives. The long journey. For those on neutral paths, the monotony of the journey itself becomes a lesson in patience and introspection. End of section 5. Episode 6. Crossroads of Intentions. Preamble. The terrain shifts drastically as each pair finds themselves nearing or departing significant thresholds, from the intensity of relief of suffering to the reflective depths of causes of suffering zone. And the hopeful terrain of the social reform zone. The characters wrestle with the evolving challenges of their paths. Their journeys begin to intersect in unexpected ways, sparking moments of tension, revelation, and collaboration. The structure of episode 6. 1. Abraham Maslow. Status. Approaches suffering zone. Setting. I don't know. I need to put the word zone all the way through these things. It just doesn't kind of read properly otherwise. Status. Abraham Maslow approaches the suffering zone. Setting. A barren plain scattered with jagged rocks and rust-coloured dust, the air heavy with an unseen pressure. Key event. Maslow begins to notice faint mirages of his past struggles. His mother's stern face, the loneliness of his youth, and flashes of his heart attack. Conflict. He pauses, feeling the pull of self-doubt. What if I'm not ready to face this? He murmurs to himself. Resolution. A lone bird appears, circling above him, its path forming a spiral. Taking this as a sign, Maslow presses forward with cautious determination. 2. Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Status. Approaches suffering zone. Setting a narrow path lined with faded photographs of people in anguish, their faces eerily familiar to Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Key event. Charles Dickens recognizes some of the faces as inspirations for his characters, while Oliver sees reflections of himself as a young boy on the streets. Conflict. Oliver grows fearful, saying, "Why do we have to go this way?" Charles Dickens reassures him, "Because sometimes the only way to heal is to see what broke us." Resolution. They step forward together, Charles Dickens' hand resting gently on Oliver's shoulder as they enter the edge of the suffering zone. Episode 6. Hold on. Episode 6.3. Holden Ford, FBI, and Johan Georg Harman, romantic idealist. Together, the status, they arrive at the relief of suffering zone. The setting, a serene field of soft grass with a single crystal clear stream winding through it. The air is warm, and the tension in their bodies begins to ease. The key event, Holden Ford sits by the stream, dipping his hands into the cool water, his breathing slowing for the first time in what feels like days. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, watches quietly before asking, "What is it you fear most?" Conflict. Holden hesitates, but eventually confesses, I fear that the work I've done has made me know better than the people I've tried to understand. Resolution. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, replies, "Understanding does not make you complicit, Holden. It makes you human." The weight in Holden's shoulders visibly lessens as the stream reflects their faces back to them, clear and unblemished. Episode 6.4, Davy, Crockett and Brian Wilson. Status: they left the relief of suffering zone, heading for the suffering zone. Setting: a forest of towering blackened trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The key event: Davy Crockett marches ahead confidently, but Brian Wilson hesitates, looking back towards the meadow they've just left. Do we have to go this way? Brian Wilson asks. Conflict. Davy Crockett responds, darn it, the meadow was rest, but it ain't where we find answers. Sometimes you gotta face the storm head on. Resolution. Brian Wilson takes a deep breath, nodding as he reluctantly follows. The shadows of the forest close in around them, but Davy's steady presence provides a flicker of reassurance. Episode 6, Part 5, Section 5, Aspect 5. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, and Bill Tench, FBI. Status: they're entering the causes of suffering zone. Setting: a labyrinth of echoing corridors, the walls adorned with faint, shifting images of their failures and regrets. Key event: Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, pauses to admire the beauty in the shifting light patterns, while Bill Tench, FBI, grows increasingly agitated. This place isn't art. It's a damn trap, Bill mutters. Conflict. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, counters, it's both. Beauty and pain are often intertwined. Bill snaps, I don't need philosophy. I need a way out. Resolution. Despite their differences, they continue together. The tension between them, thick, but balanced by a reluctant understanding. Episode 6, Section 6, Lara Croft and James. Status: they are leaving causes of suffering zone and heading for the path social reform. The path and social reform. Setting: a sloping path that gradually brightens with golden rays of sunlight breaking through a thinning canopy of trees. A key event: Lara reflects on the challenges they've faced in the causes of suffering zone, while James Brown hums softly, finding solace in the rhythm of his steps. The conflict. Lara Croft says, we've faced the worst of ourselves. But what do we do with that now? James Brown responds, Man, we take it to the people. Ain't no point in surviving if you can't make it mean something. Resolution. They both quicken their pace, the path widening as the sounds of distant voices echo ahead, signaling their approach to the social reform zone. End of episode 6 section summary thing. Episode 7, Crossroads of Growth. Preamble. New frontiers. The paths of the terrain began to intertwine, drawing pairs closer to pivotal encounters. Some moved deeper into the suffering zone, while others find themselves on the cusp of discovery, insight, or confrontation. Each step forward sharpens the journey's stakes, as the landscape reflects their choices, struggles, and connections. Structure of episode 7. 1. Abraham Maslow. Status, he's deep into the suffering zone. Setting, a barren expanse where shifting mirages of past failures and regrets rise and fall. Key event, Maslow begins to confront moments where his theories fell short or were misunderstood. Shadows of his past colleagues and students seem to speak to him, questioning his ideals. Conflict. What if I've built a pyramid that leads nowhere? Maslow wonders aloud, doubt creeping into his resolve. Resolution. He presses onward, realizing that even uncertainty is part of the process of self-actualisation. 2. Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Status, deep into the suffering zone. Setting, a desolate forest of twisted trees where faces from their past lives seem to emerge from the bark, whispering accusations and laments. Key event, Dickens tries to shield Oliver Twist from the phantoms of his past. Figures like Bill Sykes and Fagin. But Oliver steps forward, determined to face them. Conflict. Dickens struggles with his protective instincts, feeling torn between guiding Oliver Twist and letting him stand on his own. Resolution. Oliver looks back and says, "You've shown me the way. Now I have to take the steps myself." Moved, Dickens follows, his admiration for Oliver's courage deepening. 3. FBI Holden Ford and German idealist Johan Harman status, they're leaving relief of suffering and heading for the path, social reform. Setting, a quiet pathway lined with budding flowers. The light ahead growing brighter and more structured. Key event. Holden begins to process his experiences in the relief of suffering zone, reflecting on how his personal struggles align with broader social issues. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, listens, offering quiet philosophical insights. Conflict. Question. How do you reform a society that doesn't even want to admit it's broken? Holden asks. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, responds by reforming the smallest unit, the self. Resolution. Holden's steps become more determined as they approach the threshold of the social reform zone. Davy Crockett and Brian Wilson. Status. They are in the suffering zone, nearing insight. Setting. A rocky ravine filled with echoes of their past. The air feels heavy, and their own voices seem to call out to them from unseen corners. The key event. Davy Crockett reflects on the sacrifices he made in his political and personal life, while Brian Wilson his haunting melodies from his troubled past. Conflict. Brian Wilson lashes out. What's the point of this? All it does is hurt. Davy Crockett replies, the point isn't to avoid the pain. It's to find out what's worth suffering for. Resolution. The two press onward their shared burdens, fostering an unspoken camaraderie. Five. Hold on. All kinds of stuff going on. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, and Bill Tench, FBI. Status, they are leaving the causes of suffering, heading for the suffering zone. Setting, a narrow corridor lined with fragmented mirrors, where images of their personal failures morph into glimpses of their potential paths forward. Key event. Bill grows frustrated, feeling trapped by the reflections, while Friedrich Schlegel, the romantic visionary, begins to see patterns and connections in the chaos. Conflict. Bill snaps, "Look, you can't just think your way out of this." Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, replies, "And you can't force your way through, not without understanding what's holding you back." The resolution. They step through the corridor, their tension unresolved, but their path clearer. Lara Croft, and James Brown. Status, deep into social reform. The setting, a vast plaza filled with bustling activity, people debating, constructing monuments and painting vivid murals of hope and change. The key events. Lara observes the structural organization of the space, noting its strengths and flaws, while James Brown engages with the people, his charisma drawing them into conversation. Conflict. You can't just dance your way through this, Lara says. Half smiling, hold on, let me do that again. Lara says, you can't just dance your way through this, half smiling. Or even, Lara says, half smiling, you can't just dance your way through this. James Brown retorts, and you can't just stare at the cracks and expect them to fix themselves. Resolution. They begin to work together, blending Lara's analytical skills with James's ability to inspire action. The themes for episode 7. 1. Deepening strength. 1. Deepening struggles. The characters face more personal and societal challenges, pushing them to examine their motivations and fears. 2. Crossroads of insight. Each pair begins to find moments of clarity that will shape their next steps. 3. Collaborative growth. The emphasis on teamwork grows stronger as the characters realize they cannot navigate these challenges alone. End of episode 7's synopsis snap view. Episode 8.
Abraham Maslow, Charles Dickens, and Oliver Twist, guided by the Buddha, reach and enter the forest of darkness and the clearing of shadows. In the zone of suffering, the trees loomed black and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching into a darkened sky. Beneath them, the forest floor was a patchwork of slick moss and sharp, uneven stone that crunched underfoot. A faint mist clung to the roots, carrying whispers that vanished before they could be understood. Here and there, pale fungi cast a dim, cold glow, enough to hint at paths but not to banish the shadows. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of iron, mingling with the earthy scent of decay. Shadows moved unpredictably, quick and furtive, just beyond sight. Occasionally, the distant flutter of wings broke the silence as black ravens shifted on their perches high above, watching the group with unblinking eyes. Ahead of them, Abraham Maslow, Charles Dickens, and Oliver Twist. The Buddha walked with unshaken serenity, his saffron robe catching the faint light of the fungi as he moved. His bare feet seemed untouched by the jagged ground, and he stepped as though guided by a deeper knowing of the forest. Without speaking, he would glance back now and then, his calm gaze urging them forward into the strange, oppressive space. His presence was steady, neither hurried nor hesitant, leading them further into the unknown. Abraham Maslow followed, his steps thoughtful and deliberate. He carried a small notebook in one hand, occasionally pausing to jot down an idea or diagram sparked by the strange surroundings. His thinning hair stirred in the slight breeze as he absently smoothed it with a hand, a habitual gesture that hinted at his reflective nature. His eyes moved constantly, studying the shifting shadows and faint lights, as though searching for meaning in the strange forest. Beside him, Charles Dickens walked with a curious mix of apprehension and fascination, his expression shifting between furrowed thought and quiet wonder. He listened intently as Maslow shared his observations in measured, thoughtful tones. Though the forest's oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh on them both, their quiet exchanges wove a thread of humanity into the otherworldly setting. The drumming sound that echoed faintly from the forest depths seemed to align with the group's uneven pace, its rhythm a reminder of the strange living presence surrounding them. The Buddha moved ahead, a silent guide through the stillness, as the group pressed deeper into the zone of suffering. Narration script: Abraham Maslow in the suffering zone, with Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist listening to him. The suffering zone stretched endlessly ahead, a shifting mist of memories and shadows. Abraham Maslow walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him, Charles Dickens moved with a contemplative air, his hand resting gently on the shoulder of the ghostly Oliver Twist, who trailed slightly behind, his wide eyes absorbing everything. Maslow paused, his gaze fixed on an image forming in the mist. It was an image of a young boy fleeing as rocks were hurled at him.
What a man can be, he must be.
Maslow murmured, almost to himself. He turned to the others.
But the world didn't let me be what I could be. I was different, Jewish, and that made me a target. They chased me, threw rocks at me. Anti-Semitism, racism, they're wounds that never fully heal.
Oliver Twist tilted his head, his voice soft and hesitant.
I know what it's like, sir, to feel hunted, to be seen as less than human.
Charles placed a steadying hand on Oliver's shoulder, but said nothing, his expression deeply sympathetic. Maslow continued, his voice thick with emotion.
I never found refuge at home either. My mother, she was selfish, unkind. I hated her for it. She taught me how to survive, but not how to love. That emptiness, it shapes you.
Charles nodded, his brow furrowed.
Suffering has been stronger than all other teaching. It bends us, but perhaps it shapes us into something better too.
The mist shifted, revealing a dimly lit library. A young boy sat alone, surrounded by books. Maslow gestured toward the scene.
Books were my sanctuary. When people failed me, I turned to words. They made the world bearable, gave me meaning when everything else felt empty.
He glanced at Charles Dickens.
You'd understand, wouldn't you? Yes, the sacred is in the ordinary, in neighbors, family, daily life. But when I couldn't find it there, I found it in stories.
Charles offered a faint smile.
Yes, books offer a solace like no other, a world beyond this one.
Maslow's expression softened before turning somber again.
But even then, I wanted more. I wanted to prove I was enough. I thought strength would make me whole. I lifted weights, trained, but the mirror doesn't lie. I guess I was like a boy with a hammer. Every problem looked like a nail.
Oliver spoke quietly, his gaze on the ground.
I thought strength would keep me safe too, but it never did.
The boy's words lingered in the mist, as Maslow's gaze shifted toward flickering images of war. He shuddered slightly.
Then came war. I didn't fight, but I felt it. The horrors, they changed me. We fear our highest possibilities, but we fear the worst too. I chose growth, to step forward even when fear clawed at me to stay back.
The shadow of a hospital bed appeared, and Maslow touched his chest reflexively. Charles frowned deeply. Maslow nodded, his voice quieter now.
In 1967, I had a heart attack, and that kind of thing. It forces you to look at time differently. It makes you realize how fragile we are. I learned that being in the present moment, really being there, is essential to wellness.
Charles Dickens frowned deeply.
Time is the one thing we never have enough of, is it?
Maslow nodded, his voice quieter now.
No, it's not. And that's why I spent my life helping others see what they be. A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write. And if I am to be at peace with myself, I must help others self-actualize.
Charles's hand remains on Oliver's shoulder, his face shadowed, but filled with compassion. Oliver glances between the two men, his young face a mixture of sadness and hope. Together they walk deeper into the suffering zone, the faint light of understanding glimmering ahead. Together they walk deeper into the suffering zone, the faint light of understanding glimmering ahead. The two men pause in their wandering, the soft light of the zone of suffering casting long shadows across the ground. Abraham Maslow stood silent for a moment, his notebook in hand, as Charles Dickens watched him with curiosity. The air seemed to grow still as the Buddha stepped forward, his voice calm and steady as he addressed Maslow directly.
Abraham,
the Buddha began.
Let me share a story with you, a parable about a man who built a perfect mansion, shaped like a grand pyramid. On the ground level, he created endless supplies of food, warm baths, and plush beds to satisfy every comfort. On the second level, he placed security vaults and guards to protect everything he owned. The third level housed his wife, children, and friends, and it was alive with endless parties to meet his need for love and belonging.
On the fourth level, he displayed his trophies, certificates, and photographs, symbols of achievements and esteem. And finally, at the very peak, he placed a throne surrounded by mirrored walls and ceilings, a gymnasium, and every emblem of ultimate self-fulfillment.
The Buddha's eyes held Maslow's as he continued.
But as the man sat on his throne at the top, surveying all he had built, he felt an emptiness he could not explain. He thought he had reached the pinnacle of life, but something was missing.
Dickens leaned in slightly, his brow furrowed as the Buddha's voice softened.
Seeking answers, the man left his pyramid and wandered into a bustling hawker's market. There, the chaos of life unfolded. The sights, the smells, the laughter, and the shouts of strangers bargaining for bread and fruit.
Among the crowd, he saw a monk in a simple rag robe, carrying nothing but a small begging bowl. The monk moved serenely through the chaos, his face illuminated by a gentle smile. Strangers dropped their meager offerings into his bowl, and the monk's joy was reflected in their faces as they shared what little they had.
Maslow's fingers twitched slightly, his pen tapping against the edge of his notebook as the Buddha's words hung in the air.
The man approached the monk and asked, "How can you with so little be so content, while I with everything feel empty?"
The Buddha paused, his gaze steady.
The monk replied, "Because you build to hold, and I walk to let go. True wealth is in connection, not possession."
Maslow's eyes widened, and he took a slow, deliberate breath as the Buddha continued.
The man returned to his pyramid barefoot, and as he walked, he realized its walls were not protecting him, but trapping him. The next day, he joined the monk at the market, offering food and blessings alongside him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, not at the peak of his creation, but among the people he had once overlooked.
Dickens, silent until now, nodded slowly, his expression a blend of reflection and understanding. The Buddha turned to Maslow, his voice resonating with clarity.
True fulfillment is not in building higher, Abraham, but in dismantling what separates us from others. Let go and you will find the peak experience not above, but within simplicity.
As the words settled between them, Maslow closed his notebook, his movements unhurried. He lifted his gaze, his warm, reflective eyes meeting the Buddha's.
I think I see it now. It's not the pyramid that holds us. It's the path we walk together.
In the stillness of the zone of suffering, Maslow closed his eyes for a moment. He envisioned the pyramid he had so carefully built in his mind melting away, its walls dissolving into a shared path. On that path, he saw himself walking barefoot among others, the weight of possessions replaced by the lightness of connection. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to let go.
The Clearing of Shadows. Section 2 of Chapter 8, of Episode 8. The Clearing of Shadows. The Buddha moved ahead in silence, his saffron robe catching the soft glow of the faint golden light that flickered at the heart of the clearing. His steps were calm and deliberate, as though the swirling shadows and faint hum of the monoliths posed no obstacle. The concentric stone pillars seemed to hum faintly in response to his presence, their etched runes glowing with a quiet rhythm that pulsed through the heavy air. Abraham Maslow and Oliver Twist followed behind, their movements slower, hesitant. The weight of the clearing's strange atmosphere seemed to press down on them. The Buddha did not glance back, but continued forward, his presence an unspoken guide through the fragmented light and shadow. The onyx tree at the center stood stark and motionless, its jagged form drawing their attention as they approached. The faint breeze carried a warmth that brushed against their faces like a fleeting touch, urging them onward. Abraham Maslow glanced at Oliver, his quiet encouragement a steadying presence for the boy, who clutched his oversized coat and scanned the space with wide, uncertain eyes. Together, Abraham Maslow, Oliver Twist, and Charles Dickens followed the Buddha along the pale spiral of sand, moving closer to the clearing's core and the truths waiting to be uncovered. The parable of Oliver Twist. As the group moved deeper into the zone of suffering, the Buddha turned to Oliver Twist. The boy, his oversized coat tugged tightly around his frame, looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. His pale, freckled face betrayed both hunger and hope, and his thin frame seemed to tremble with the weight of his past. The Buddha began, his voice gentle but resonant. Oliver, let me tell you a story. There was once a young boy who grew up on the streets, surrounded by thieves who taught him to steal for survival. He became skilled at it, so much so that his peers admired him. Yet, despite the fleeting victories, he felt an emptiness he could not escape. One day, the boy stole from a kind merchant running a modest food stall. The merchant caught him in the act, but instead of anger, the man's face softened. He handed the boy a fresh loaf of bread and said, "Take it, not because you stole it, but because I give it freely." The boy was stunned. He could hardly believe such kindness existed. The next day he returned, but this time he didn't steal. Instead, he asked for work. The merchant agreed, teaching him how to bake bread, serve others, and share what he had with those in need. Years later, the boy opened a community kitchen. He fed the hungry, gave warmth to the cold, and found joy in seeing the faces of those he helped. He learned that true wealth was not in what he took, but in what he gave. The Buddha paused, allowing the words to settle. He placed a steady hand on Oliver's shoulder and said, "To steal is to take what belongs to all and make it yours. To give is to return it to the world, creating trust, peace, and true wealth." Oliver's eyes filled with wonder as he pictured the story. In his mind, he saw himself in a monastery, sharing food with travellers, the faces of Fagin and the artful Dodger fading into distant memory. For the first time, he imagined belonging, not through survival, but through kindness. Buddha's compassionate gesture. The Buddha paused, his serene gaze resting on Oliver, whose thin frame trembled slightly in the cool air. With a soft smile, the Buddha reached into a simple bag at his side and pulled out a bowl of warm rice porridge, sesame-seeded buns, sweet cakes, and fresh fruit. Offering the meal to Oliver, he said, "Eat, child. You cannot journey far on an empty stomach." Oliver hesitated, his small hands trembling as he accepted the food. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He ate slowly at first, then with increasing eagerness, the warmth of the food chasing away the cold knot of hunger that had been his constant companion. As the boy finished, the Buddha gently handed him a bundle of clean clothes and a pair of sturdy shoes. "These will keep you comfortable," the Buddha said, his voice calm and reassuring. "The path ahead is hard, but you do not walk it alone." Oliver looked at the gifts with wide, astonished eyes, his nervous shuffling momentarily replaced by stillness. Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice tinged with both wonder and disbelief. The Buddha's smile deepened. "Because you deserve kindness, Oliver, and because within you lies the strength to choose a different path." The Buddha sat beside him and spoke gently, offering words that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. "There is a teaching, Oliver, from the Dhammapada. By oneself is one purified. By oneself is one defiled. This means your strength lies within. Trust your moral compass, child. You need not depend on men like Fagin or Bill Sykes to survive. The power to shape your own path is yours." Oliver blinked, digesting the words, his freckled face etched with concentration. The Buddha continued, his tone steady and encouraging. Another teaching comes from the Maha Mangala Sutta. It's this: living in a suitable environment and setting oneself on the right path. This is the greatest blessing. Oliver, seek out wholesome places and good-hearted people. Surround yourself with kindness and virtue, and you will find the strength to grow. Oliver looked down at his hands, now steady, no longer trembling. But how will I know who to trust? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The Buddha's eyes softened. There is wisdom in the Sigala Ovada Sutta. Avoid bad company and cultivate good companions. Be discerning, Oliver. Seek friends who lift you up, not those who drag you into harm. Trust in their goodness, and they will help you find peace. Oliver's lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but instead he only nodded. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. The Buddha placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, his touch as gentle as his words. You have endured much, Oliver, but the journey forward is yours to take. You are stronger than you know. In the stillness that followed, Oliver felt the weight of the Buddha's words settle into his heart like seeds ready to take root. For the first time, he began to believe that a different future was possible. Oliver's transformation. As the teachings sank in, Oliver clutched his stomach less often, no longer focused on the pangs of hunger, but on the warmth filling his heart. His wide-eyed wonder turned to quiet determination. For the first time, he felt he could walk upright, no longer a shadow of himself, but a boy with purpose. Abraham Maslow watched the exchange silently, his own reflective gaze softening as he saw the transformation in Oliver Twist. In the distance, the mist of the zone of suffering began to lift, revealing a shared path where they could all walk together, lighter and freer than before. Episode 8 continued. Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens speaks and Abraham Maslow listens. Charles Dickens walked steadily through the suffering zone, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant as memories played out in the swirling mist. Beside him, Abraham Maslow followed in contemplative silence, his expression one of empathy and quiet attentiveness. Charles Dickens began speaking, his voice rich and steady, tinged with both sorrow and yet resolve. Yes, I was 12 years old, Dickens began, his eyes narrowing as scenes of a grime-covered factory emerged around them. 12. My father was imprisoned for debt, and I was sent to work in a boot-blacking factory to help support the family. The smell of the blacking, the huge rats, the dark, damp, rotten timbers, that awful stink of the muddy Thames River, the constant scraping of brushes. It was a world no child should know. He paused, his voice quieter now. Child labor, Abraham, it's an abomination. And it began to shape me. It taught me the depths of human suffering, the injustice of a society that exploits its weakest. Maslow nodded solemnly. What a man can be, he must be. And what you became, Charles, was a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Charles Dickens gave a faint smile, but didn't look up. A voice, yes, but that voice was forged in pain. My father's imprisonment, it wasn't just a financial blow, it was an emotional one. The shame, the stigma, it clings to a boy, you know. I had to shoulder burdens beyond my years, and the memory of it never quite leaves you. The mist shifted, revealing the figure of a young boy sitting on a stool, his head bowed over a book. Charles Dickens gestured towards him. See that education was my refuge. Oh, it would have been had it not been disrupted by poverty. I had to abandon school when my family's situation worsened, though I returned later, briefly. Still, it left its mark, a hunger for knowledge, but also great fear of losing it. Abraham Maslow again. Abraham Maslow spoke gently. The sacred is in the ordinary, Charles. In the pages of books, in the pursuit of learning. That hunger, it's what drives us forward, even in the darkest times. Charles Dickens inclined his head. Indeed, Abraham, but hunger of another sort, hunger for justice. That has weighed on me just as heavily. I saw the poor, the exploited, the downtrodden, and I felt their pain as my own. Victorian society was a harsh master, and I could not turn away from its cruelties. His voice grew firmer. The law is an ass, he said bitterly, quoting one of his characters. And the judicial system is an ass's master. Abraham Maslow's brow furrowed. You know, To face such a world and still strive for growth, that is no small thing. Charles, you turned your pain into purpose. Charles Dickens chuckled softly. Purpose, yes, but at what cost? My career, my writing, my readings, they drained me, body and soul. The mist formed images of Charles Dickens on stage, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Public readings and revisions, meeting expectations, it takes its toll. There's a wonderful line I once wrote. Heaven knows we need never be ashamed of our tears. And yet, I often was ashamed of mine. Too much pride, I suppose. Maslow placed a hand over his heart. Tears are rain upon the dust of the earth, Charles. They nourish the soul, even as they cleanse it. Charles Dickens turned to him, his expression softening. Perhaps, yes, but they couldn't cleanse the struggles of my family. Tensions with my wife, the demands of a large household, it all weighed very heavily on me. The truth is, Abraham, suffering has been stronger than all other teaching. It has bent and it's broken me. Yes, but I hope it has shaped me into something better. It has, Maslow said quietly. Your suffering didn't just shape you, it shaped the world around you. It gave you the empathy to create, to inspire. Dickens gave a small, grateful nod. Thank you for that, my friend. If I've lightened the burdens of others even a little, then perhaps it was worth it. They walked on in silence for a time, the mist parting before them as the echoes of Dickens' words hung in the air. Switch focus to the journey of Holden Ford and Johan Harman, the German romantic idealist. 3. The Temple of Still Dreams. The Buddha walked ahead in silence, his movements fluid and purposeful, as though the path itself was bending to his will. The dense forest began to thin, giving way to a clearing where the temple emerged, its spires piercing the sky with an otherworldly glow. Holden Ford, the FBI detective, and Johan Harman, romantic idealist, followed closely, their footsteps muffled against the shifting mosaic of mirrored light beneath their feet. The towering structure before them was unlike anything they had seen. Its iridescent stone shifting colors in the dim light, casting an ethereal brilliance onto their faces. Johan Harman, romantic idealist's gaze drifted upwards, his sharp, poetic eyes tracing the symbols etched into the walls, glowing faintly in sapphire and gold. He slowed his pace, his hand brushing against one of the coiled roots, anchoring the temple to the earth. This temple, he murmured, almost to himself, it feels like a paradox, rooted in the earth, yet reaching for the heavens. Holden, his stride more purposeful but his expression guarded, looked towards the massive archway ahead, flanked by gargantuan statues whose features had been weathered into ambiguity. "It's imposing," he said, his voice tight. "Feels like it's watching, doesn't it?" His eyes flicked to the twisting forms carved into the impossibly high columns, vines entwined with serpents that seemed to writhe in the flickering shadows. The Buddha paused briefly at the archway, his saffron robe glowing faintly in the refracted light. He turned his head slightly, just enough to ensure they followed before stepping inside. The soft chime of crystalline echoes greeted them, mingling with the distant roar of water that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As they passed through the archway, the air grew heavier, dense with the scent of myrrh and burning cedar. Johan Harman, a romantic idealist, he closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply as though the fragrance held unspoken truths. "The air, it carries stories here," he said softly. "Layers upon layers of meaning." Inside, the vastness of the temple swallowed them whole. I'm going to do that again. Inside, the vastness of the temple swallowed them whole. Holden's steps faltered as his eyes took in the shattered mosaic of mirrors beneath their feet, each fragment catching and distorting the dim light into chaotic brilliance. "What kind of place is this?" he muttered, his tone more wary than curious. The flickering shadows along the walls seemed to move in response, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, stepped closer to one of the glowing pools of liquid silver lining the chamber. "This is a space for reflection," he said, his voice calm yet tinged with awe. "It's a place that shows you not what is, but what might be." He glanced at Holden, his expression thoughtful. "Don't you think?" Holden didn't answer immediately, his attention caught by the constellations embedded in the black glass dome overhead. They pulsed faintly, shifting in patterns that seemed alive, almost deliberate. A faint whispering sound drifted through the air, indistinct but persistent, tugging at the edges of his mind. "It's like it knows we're here," he said finally, his voice low. The Buddha moved to the center of the chamber, where the translucent quartz altar stood, emitting a soft, steady glow. He rested his hand lightly on its surface, his posture serene and unshaken. Without a word, he glanced back at the two men, his eyes calm and steady, and gestured for them to come closer. The subtle motion seemed to fill the cavernous space with unspoken guidance, as if the temple itself was alive with his presence. Holden exchanged a hesitant glance with Johan Harman before stepping forward, the shattered mirrors crunching faintly underfoot. Guess this is where the real lesson starts," he murmured, his voice tinged with unease. The romantic idealist smiled faintly, his gaze drifting towards the glowing symbols, pulsing rhythmically along the walls. Or perhaps he said, "This is where it all begins to make sense." Perhaps it is. Together they approached the altar, their footsteps merging with a rhythmic hum that vibrated through the air. Above them, the shifting constellations seemed to align momentarily, casting faint patterns across the mirrored floor. The zone of suffering awaited. Episode 8, Part 2. Narration script. Holden Ford. In the Suffering Zone, with Johan Harman, the romantic idealist. The fog of the Suffering Zone loomed heavily as Holden Ford walked alongside Johan Harman, romantic idealist. The philosopher's pensive face barely visible in the shifting grey. Holden's stride was quick and methodical, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. Johan Harman, romantic idealist, calm and contemplative, let Holden speak, occasionally offering a quiet nod or murmured reflection. Holden exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, as the mist around them coalesced into the haunting image of a man sitting across from him at a table. Ed Kemper.
The first time I sat across from him,
Holden began, his voice tight,
I thought I could handle it. I mean, I remember Bill saying, how do we get ahead of crazy if we don't know how crazy thinks?
His words hung in the air, as if the fog itself was absorbing them.
But I didn't know, not really.
He stopped, his shoulders slumping.
After that visit, I started getting panic attacks. You know what it's like to feel your chest closing in, your heart pounding so hard it feels like it's trying to escape? It's terrifying. And it's because of him.
Johan Harman tilted his head, his voice soft and measured.
To face madness directly is to risk being consumed by it. You tread a dangerous line, Holden. May God be with you.
Holden nodded. His eyes were distant.
Yeah, dangerous is right.
He gestured around them.
And the worst part? I'm isolated in all of this. Even my colleagues, Bill and Wendy, they doubt me. Think I'm arrogant, a loose cannon. I hear it in the way they talk to me, the way they look at me. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? But that kind of thinking doesn't win you any friends.
The fog shifted, revealing a shadowy figure walking away from Holden. He clenched his fists.
Debbie. She left because I couldn't stop talking about work, about them, the killers. I just couldn't shut it off. I mean, what difference does any of this make if we can't communicate it to the people who matter? But, didn't get that. She wanted me to talk about us, about normal things. I couldn't do it.
Johan Harman, romantic idealist's gaze was steady, his tone gentle.
To be consumed by a single pursuit is to lose sight of the broader image of life. You chased understanding, but forgot connection, perhaps.
Holden shook his head, his jaw tightening.
You think I don't know that?
He gestured to the mist as another scene formed. A prison, stark and cold, the faces of Charles Manson, BTK, and others flickered like ghosts.
I've stared into the eyes of monsters, Johan. I've asked them questions, tried to understand what set them off. When you're sitting across from someone who's done things you can't even begin to comprehend, it gets to you. It changes you.
The philosopher paused, his voice softening.
And has it brought you closer to the answers you seek?
Holden didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the ground, his face a mask of frustration.
Sometimes it feels like I'm forcing a square peg into a round hole just because I want it to fit. Like, if I could just figure out the pattern, the logic. But there isn't always logic. And when the cases don't go as planned, when the killers keep killing, I doubt myself. I doubt everything.
Johan Harman folded his hands in front of him.
Doubt is the price we pay for inquiry. But do not let it paralyze you, Holden. In faith, even the fragmented truth can guide us.
The mists shifted again, and this time Holden saw himself standing alone in a darkened, fluorescent-lit office. The space felt cold, empty.
I have no one, Johan,
he admitted, his voice quieter now.
No friends, no family. Just this job, and even that, it doesn't feel like enough. I'm trying to stop something bigger than myself, and I don't even know if it's possible. How do you stop something you don't fully understand?
Johan placed a hand on Holden's shoulder, his expression one of deep compassion.
Perhaps you cannot stop it, Holden. But by seeking to understand it, you offer the world a gift, a wisdom that may one day be its salvation.
Holden looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair.
Maybe. But it doesn't feel like a gift when it's tearing me apart.
Johan, as a romantic idealist, gave a small, sad smile.
Pursuit of truth often comes with suffering. But remember, Holden, you are not alone in this struggle. Even in the darkness, there are others seeking the light.
The two men continued walking, their conversation fading into the fog. Holden's words carried the weight of his anguish, but Johan Harman, that romantic idealist's quiet wisdom lingered, offering a faint but steady glimmer of hope. And together they moved deeper into the suffering zone, their paths intertwining as they searched for meaning amidst the chaos. Episode 8. Narration script. Johan Georg Harman, the romantic idealist, is in the suffering zone with Holden Ford. The mist of the suffering zone swirled gently as Johan Georg Harman, romantic idealist, walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the dim horizon. Holden Ford walked beside him, his analytical gaze fixed on the philosopher. Johan Harman. His voice broke the silence first, calm but laden with the weight of introspection.
Poetry
Johan began softly, almost as though speaking to himself.
Is the mother tongue of the human race. Yet for so long, I tried to sever my own tongue, to silence the voice within that longed for more than reason could provide. In London, I found myself lost, drowning in a sea of despair. It was there, amid the chaos, that I touched the divine. And yet even now, I wonder, was it faith or madness that found me?
Holden frowned, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of Johan's words.
Yes. And beyond that edge, I saw both salvation and exile. My conversion, my faith, it saved me, and yet it alienated me from the world I once knew.
That's
transformation feels like, doesn't it? The fog, the disconnection. You said, the farther reason looks, the greater is the haze in which it loses itself. It sounds like you reached the edge of reason and saw something beyond. Reason only gets you so far. I've spent years trying to make sense of things that can't be understood. Evil, violence.
That's what transformation feels like, doesn't it? The fog, the disconnection. You said, the farther reason looks, the greater is the gaze in which it loses itself. It sounds like you reached the edge of reason and saw something beyond. Johan Harman paused, considering Holden's words. Yes, he murmured. And beyond that edge, I saw both salvation and exile. My conversion, my faith, it saved me. And yet it alienated me from the world I once knew. I turned away from the Enlightenment, or the so-called Enlightenment, the rationalism, from the gods of reason, and they turned away from me. Even Immanuel Kant. His voice faltered slightly, but steadied himself. Kant and I were as brothers once. But reason and faith are siblings who quarreled too much to share a home. Holden nodded, his own conflicts surfacing unbidden. Reason gets you only so far, he said, his voice quieter now. I've spent years trying to make sense of things that can't be understood. Evil, violence. Trying to understand why someone would kill. And when you face, and again, and when you sit face to face with someone who's done those things, reason feels useless, empty. The romantic idealist's lips curved in a small, sad smile, and Johan said, Not only the entire ability to think rests on language, he said, his voice steady, but language is also the crux of the misunderstanding of reason with itself. Words fail us, Holden. They fail to capture the essence of what we seek. The fog lifted again. The fog thickened, and ghostly images of Johan Harman's past materialized around them. His modest clerical office, the faces of contemporaries who had mocked his ideas, and the empty spaces where recognition should have been. They call me eccentric, Johan said, his voice distant now. They dismissed my words, my critiques, because I would not conform. I chose brevity over volume, poetry over prose, faith over reason, and so I became a stranger to my time. Holden's voice cut through the quiet. And that isolation, it gets to you, doesn't it? Makes you question whether it's worth it. Whether the truth you're chasing is enough to fill the gap it leaves behind. The romantic idealist turned to Holden, his gaze sharp yet empathetic, and Johan said, The philosophers have always given truth a bill of divorce, separating what nature has joined together. But truth is not something we possess, it is something that possesses us. Yes, it isolates, it marginalizes, but what choice do we have? To betray it would be to betray ourselves. Holden exhaled slowly, his thoughts aligning with Johan's in ways he hadn't expected. You're right, he admitted. We can ignore the truth, even if it costs us. But damn, sometimes it feels the cost is too high. They continued walking, the fog revealing brief glimpses of Johan Harman's ideas and struggles, his modest home, his philosophical debates, his conversion. The images were fleeting, but the weight of them lingered. The romantic idealist spoke again, his voice softer now, as Johan said, "So weakness of ourselves and of our reason makes us see flaws in beauties," he said. "I see now that my suffering, my failures, they were not flaws, but part of the whole. And perhaps the same is true for you, Holden." Holden didn't reply immediately, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. Finally, Holden said, "Maybe. But it's hard to see the beauty when you're surrounded by the flaws." The romantic idealist placed a hand lightly on Holden's arm. Johan's gaze was filled with quiet conviction as he said, "Those flaws are what makes the beauty visible," he said simply. "Without them, we would not know what we are searching for." The two men walked on, their conversation blending into the stillness of the suffering zone. Johan Harman, the romantic idealist, those German words, those steeped in his own struggles, I'm going to do that again. Sorry again. Johan Harman, the German romantic idealist's words, though steeped in his own struggles, seemed to offer Holden a kind of solace, a reminder that even in isolation, even in the face of misunderstanding, the pursuit of truth was its own quiet redemption. Continuing on from Harman and Holden in the suffering zone, episode 8, part 4, on to an addended bit which has a description of the inner still pool within the temple. The air shifts, becoming cooler and carrying the scent of fresh rain as the space opens to reveal the still pool. The pool is perfectly circular, its surface a flawless mirror reflecting the glowing constellations of the temple's dome. The water appears black, yet shimmers with an inner light, as though stars are embedded just beneath the surface. Smooth, obsidian-like stones line the edges, their surfaces polished to a black glassy sheen. Small ripples travel across the pool without any visible cause, distorting the reflections like living echoes. A soft ethereal hum emanates from the water, resonating in harmony with the pulsing wall symbols. The surrounding floor is etched with intricate spirals, glowing faintly in pale blue. Columns encircle the pool, each carved with images of mythical creatures in mid-motion. The air feels charged, almost electric, as if the space is alive with hidden energy. Tiny droplets fall from the ceiling in slow motion, disappearing before they hit the water. A faint mist rises from the pool, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine. Light from the quartz altar reflects reflects into the pool, carrying an interplay of shifting rainbows. Shadows from the columns stretch and contract as though responding to an unseen rhythm. The soundscape is tranquil, yet otherworldly. The faint crackle of energy, the echo of distant chimes. The edges of the pool seem to blur into the floor, giving the illusion of infinite depth. The air is noticeably colder near the water, almost biting, yet strangely invigorating. The reflections on the pool shift slightly as though capturing movements from another world. The dome above grows more vivid, its constellation-like patterns swirling slowly, matching the ripples below. The silence here feels profound, almost sacred, broken only by the occasional echo of distant melodic tones. The overall space feels timeless, as though it had existed outside the bounds of reality. Episode 8, Part 5, Narration Script. Davy Crockett, reflecting with Brian Wilson listening.
The wilderness around them felt alive with echoes of the past, trees whispering with the wind, a distant river rushing like time itself. Davy Crockett walked with his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face etched with the rugged resilience of a life lived on the edge. Brian Wilson trailed slightly behind, his eyes wide and contemplative, absorbing every word as Davy Crockett began to speak.
You know,
Davy Crockett started, glancing over his shoulder at Brian.
there's something about the frontier that's a lot like your music, Brian. It's wild, untamed, but beautiful if you can learn to survive it. Survival, well.
He stopped, leaning against a tree.
That's something I've been doing since I was a boy.
Brian Wilson nodded silently, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he listened. Davy's voice softened, tinged with a distant sorrow.
My father, John, always tried, you know, but life kept beating him down. Bankruptcy, floods. Every time we thought we had a foothold, it got washed away. We moved so much, I never really had a place to call home. At 12, I was hired out as a laborer to pay off his debts. Can you imagine that? A boy working to pay for his father's mistakes?
Brian Wilson hesitated, then offered quietly.
It's hard carrying the weight of someone else's struggles. My dad, Murray, he was violent, cruel. It felt like every time I wanted to grow, he'd just crush it.
Davy Crockett gave a small nod of understanding.
Sounds like we both had men in our lives who taught us resilience the hard way, but it didn't stop there for me. I lost family to violence. My grandparents killed by an attack from the Creeks and Chickamauga Cherokees. And one of my uncles, 17 years in captivity. Can you imagine how that changes a man?
Brian's voice was quiet, but firm.
Yeah, I can. Losing someone, or even just watching them suffer, it changes you. My brothers, Dennis and Carl, they're gone now. It's like losing pieces of yourself one at a time.
Davy Crockett sighed, adjusting his rifle.
And then there was love, the first girl I ever loved, Margaret Elder. She left me for another man. And Polly Finley, her mother didn't want me anywhere near her. Guess I was too rough around the edges.
Brian Wilson gave him a small, empathetic smile.
I believe in love,
he said softly.
But it's not always easy to hold on to, is it?
No, it ain't. And when you're out here fighting the wilderness and the world, there's not much time to hold on to anything. My gristmill, my tavern, they were wiped out by floods. My political career, lost that too more than once. Folks didn't like that I spoke my mind, especially about Andrew Jackson and his Indian Removal Act.
He turned to Brian, his gaze steady.
That's the thing about standing for something, though. It doesn't always make you popular. But as I've always said, be sure you're right. Then go ahead.
Brian Wilson took a deep breath, letting Davy's words settle.
You stood for something bigger than yourself. I get that. With my music, I've always tried to do the same. But sometimes it feels like it just eats you alive, the pressure, the criticism.
Davy Crockett nodded knowingly.
Pressure's a heavy burden, no matter where it comes from. But when I think about my life, I don't regret the fight, even at the Alamo. I left Tennessee to start over into Texas, and where did it get me? Death. And a legacy folks still argue about. Was I a hero, Brian? Or just a fool who didn't know when to quit?
Brian Wilson met his gaze, his voice soft but certain.
Heroes aren't perfect, Davy. They're just people who keep going, even when it's hard. And your legacy, it's not just about how you died. It's about how you lived.
The two men stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the wilderness filling the space between them. Davy Crockett nodded slowly, his eyes distant but thoughtful. Brian Wilson smiled faintly.
You've got a way with words, Brian,
he said finally.
Maybe it's that music of yours. God's voice, you called it?
Brian Wilson smiled faintly.
Yeah. Music's how I make sense of it all. Even the pain. It's like a way to turn all that suffering into something beautiful.
Davy Crockett chuckled.
A warm,
low sound.
Guess we've both been through our share of it, haven't we?
He clapped a hand on Brian's shoulder.
You're right. It ain't about the suffering. It's about what you do with it.
The pair moved on, their steps in sync now. In the quiet that followed, Davy's rugged wisdom and Brian's quiet resilience seemed to form an unspoken bond. Two men, from worlds apart, connected by the shared weight of what it means to endure.
Episode 8. Davy Crockett listens to Brian Wilson in the suffering zone. The path through the suffering zone twisted under their feet, the atmosphere heavy with echoes of Brian's past. Davy Crockett walked beside him, his steady gait and frontier strength a silent counterpoint to Brian's introspection. Davy Crockett listened, his brow furrowed in quiet sympathy as Brian Wilson began to speak, his voice tinged with melancholy. Brian Wilson glanced at the ground, as if searching for the right words.
Davy,
he began, his voice soft.
I think the Beatles were the greatest group in the world. They did things, their music was like God's voice sometimes. And I really tried to make something like that. But
his words trailed off, and he rubbed his temples.
I don't think I was made for these times.
Davy Crockett nodded slowly, his tone even.
I reckon the world can be a harsh place. Harder still if you don't feel like you fit in. But what did you do, son? You kept going. You made your music.
Brian Wilson's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Yeah, I made music. But not without a cost.
His voice dropped, and a shadowy figure formed in the mist. A man with a hard, unforgiving face.
My dad, Murray, He was cruel, violent. He pushed me, told me I'd never be good enough. I guess he thought he was toughening me up. But really, he just made me afraid of being worthless.
Davy Crockett's jaw tightened. A man like that, he's no better than the wolves I've fought. But you've done more than survive him. You've risen above him. Brian Wilson's voice quivered as he continued.
Sometimes, though, it feels like I didn't. I lost my hearing in one ear, maybe from the way he treated me. And those voices, they came later, the hallucinations. They'd tell me things, awful things, that I wasn't good enough, that everyone would leave me. I tried to drown them out with music, but it's just hard to fight what's in your head.
Davy Crockett's hand rested on his belt, his expression thoughtful. Son, I've fought bears and lost family to wars, but it sounds like the battle you're fighting is one that don't leave any visible scars. And that makes it a damn sight harder. Brian's eyes flickered with gratitude at the understanding.
It didn't help that I started messing with drugs. LSD, cocaine. I thought they'd help me escape. Instead, they just made things worse. Paranoia, delusions. It got so bad I didn't leave my room for years. I'd just sit there, overeating, listening to the voices, losing myself.
Davy Crockett looked at him, his face full of quiet compassion. It's like quicksand. The harder you fight it, the deeper it pulls you. But you're here now talking about it, that means you're still fighting, right? Brian Wilson nodded faintly.
I guess I am. But there was Eugene Landy, my therapist. He was supposed to help, but he controlled me, over-medicated me, took my money, it made me feel like I was losing the last bit of myself. And then my brothers died, Dennis and Carl. Losing them, it felt like my whole world was crumbling.
Davy Crockett stopped and turned to face him fully, his voice firm but kind. You've carried a heavy load, no doubt about it. But I've learned something in my time. A man's strength ain't in what he carries, it's in how he keeps walking when the weight's near unbearable. Brian Wilson let out a shaky breath, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly.
I believe in love, in good vibrations, in being a good person. It's why I keep writing. When I'm writing, I don't hold back. I just let it all out. It's the only way I know how to fight the darkness.
Davy Crockett's lips curved into a faint smile.
Then keep writing, son. You've got a voice, and it's worth more than all the gold in Texas. Be sure you're right. Then go ahead. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you different.
The mist around them began to lighten, the echoes fading into a distant hum. Brian Wilson looked over at Davy Crockett, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in a while.
Thanks, Davy. I think I needed to say all that.
Davy Crockett tipped his coonskin cap.
Anytime, partner. Sometimes a man just needs someone to listen.
And with that, they continued walking, their steps carrying them further into the unknown, but no longer alone. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, reflects while Bill Tench, FBI, listens. The path through the suffering zone was steeped in shadow, echoes of fractured ideals and painful memories swirling around Friedrich Schlegel. He moved with a poetic air, his words deliberate, almost lyrical. Beside him, Bill Tench, his broad-shouldered frame steady, his expression one of quiet attentiveness. Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, began to speak, his voice tinged with both sadness and defiance.
You know,
Friedrich Schlegel, the romantic visionary, started, his gaze distant.
the historian is a prophet looking backwards. My life is like one of those histories. I thought I was chasing truth, but what I found...
He gestured at the swirling mist.
...was irony, chaos, the infinitely abundant kind.
Bill folded his arms and nodded.
Sounds messy, but I get it. You go digging for answers, and sometimes all you find is more dirt, or worse.
Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at his lips.
Indeed. When I rejected my Protestant upbringing, it wasn't just religion I left behind. It was my family, my friends. Isolation became my companion.
He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation.
And yet, I believed in the unity of opposites. Combine the extremes and you will have the true center.
Bill tilted his head slightly, his tone pragmatic.
Yeah, well, when you walk the middle road, no one on either side likes you much. People don't want nuance. They want someone to blame.
Friedrich Schlegel chuckled softly, a bitter sound.
You're not wrong. When I published Lucinde, work of love, freedom, it became a scandal. They called it obscene, immoral. I was trying to challenge the rigidity of their thinking, to show that beauty is simultaneously attractive and sublime. But all they saw was a man flaunting convention.
Sounds like they didn't know what to make of you.
Bill replied.
That's the thing about stepping outside the lines. People don't like what they can't label. It makes them uncomfortable.
The mist shifted, revealing the image of a stage and an audience turning away in disappointment. Schlegel's expression darkened.
Then there was Alakos. Goethe staged it in Weimar. My tragedy. Even those I admired most found me wanting.
Bill let out a low whistle.
Tough break. Guess it's like I tell Holden, you want truffles? You gotta get in the dirt with the pigs. But still, getting that dirt thrown back at you stings.
Friedrich Schlegel nodded, his gaze lowering.
It does. And yet I moved. Jena, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, always seeking, never staying. My restlessness wasn't just physical. It was existential. How do you root yourself when every idea you touch becomes ash?
Bill rubbed his chin thoughtfully.
Sounds like you were chasing something that couldn't be pinned down. I've seen that in my line of work too. Answers that don't make the pain go away, just more questions.
Schlegel's voice softened, taking on a wistful tone.
And then there was Dorothea. Wife. She sacrificed so much, converting from Judaism to Protestantism, then to Catholicism, just to align with me. But even love has its price, doesn't it? They called her work mine.
as if her voice was an extension of my own. How could I reconcile such injustice?
Bill's expression darkened.
Family's always a sore spot. You try to protect them, support them, but sometimes the weight's just too much. Doesn't mean you stop trying, though.
The mist shifted again, revealing the faint image of soldiers marching and proclamations burning in the wind. Friedrich Schlegel.
And the politics. Editing anti-Napoleon proclamations, serving as a diplomat. War and ideals entangle you in ways you don't expect. I thought I could shape the world, but all I found was turmoil.
Bill nodded slowly.
War's messy. Politics, you can't always fix what's broken, no matter if you try.
Friedrich Schlegel turned to Bill, his eyes searching.
But I believed in beauty, in the unfinished, the imperfect. Poetry should forever be becoming, never perfected. Isn't life the same? A constant becoming?
Bill gave a small shrug.
Maybe. But sometimes you gotta draw a line. Decide what's worth fighting for and let the rest go. You can't chase every ideal, you'll wear yourself down to nothing.
For the first time, Friedrich Schlegel smiled faintly.
Perhaps you're right. I've been chasing the sublime for so long. I forgot to rest in the ordinary.
The two men walked on, their steps steady yet thoughtful. And in their silence, the mists seemed to clear slightly. The path ahead, illuminated by an uncertain but undeniable light. Bill Tench reflects, while Friedrich Schlegel listens. The suffering zone stretched before them, a hazy expanse of memories and unresolved pain. Bill Tench walked steadily, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets, his steps deliberate. Friedrich Schlegel moved beside him, his gaze flitting between Bill and the shadows that danced across their path. Bill's expression was tight, his tone dry, but beneath the surface was the weight of someone who had seen too much.
You know, Friedrich,
Bill began, his voice low and measured.
When you're married, it's like a contract, a deal you can't quit. There's a house, kids, a mortgage, no exit clause. And me?
He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping.
I botched it. Nancy moved out, took Brian with her, said I wasn't there, wasn't present. She's right. I wasn't.
Friedrich tilted his head, his sharp eyes observing Bill's every movement.
Marriage is perhaps the greatest irony,
he said softly.
It demands union while exposing division, a combination of extremes, seeking a center.
Bill gave him a sideways glance.
Yeah, well, we didn't find that center. And Brian.
His voice caught for a moment, and he cleared his throat.
My son. He was involved in something bad. A toddler died. A kid. The cops, social services, therapy, everything spun out of control. And I didn't know how to fix it. I'm his dad. I should have protected him. But instead, I let him drift.
Friedrich Schlegel, romantic visionary, nodded slowly, his tone reflective.
A father's love is a paradox. We wish to shield them, yet life demands they face storms. Protection and independence, both necessary, yet in conflict.
Bill's jaw tightened.
Storms, yeah. And my job? That's a whole other storm. You think you've seen depravity, Friedrich? Try sitting across from a guy who tells you, without a flicker of remorse, how he killed and mutilated someone. And the worst part, you can't let it get under your skin, or you'll crack.
Friedrich Schlegel paused, his expression unreadable.
To witness the chaos of others and not absorb it. That requires an irony of the soul, a detachment that must feel like betrayal to the self.
Bill gave a short laugh, though it lacked humor.
Detachment, huh? Tell that to the nightmares. Guys like Kemper, Manson, they get into your head. And when you're sitting there, trying to understand why they did it this way, you start wondering if you're more like them than you'd like to admit.
The philosopher's gaze turned contemplative.
The historian is a prophet looking backwards,
Friedrich said quietly.
In your case, it seems the prophet must look into the abyss, and the abyss stares back.
Bill stopped walking for a moment, letting those words sink in.
Yeah,
He murmured.
that's about the size of it. And for what? To save women from getting pulled into vans and cut to pieces? To stop kids from disappearing? Most of the time, we don't even get there in time. You start to wonder if it makes a difference.
Do you believe in the potential for redemption, Bill? That even within the chaos, beauty or salvation might emerge?
Bill stared ahead, his brow furrowed.
Redemption's a nice idea, but I've seen too many lives shattered to believe it's for everyone. What I do know is that I can't stop trying. It's like truffles. You gotta get in the dirt with the pigs to find them. Sometimes it's filthy and it stinks, but maybe, just maybe, you'll dig up something that matters.
The romantic visionary regarded him with quiet respect.
It is not a path I envy, but it is one I admire. Your willingness to walk the edge, to seek meaning where others fear to tread. That is, perhaps, its own form of beauty.
Bill glanced at him, a faint smirk forming.
Beauty, huh? Never thought of my job that way. But you know what? Maybe you're onto something. After all, I'm still here. Still doing the work.
They continued walking, the weight of Bill's words lingering in the air. Schlegel said nothing more, his silence speaking volumes. The mist began to part slightly, revealing a faint path ahead, uncertain, but leading forward all the same. Lara speaks. James Brown listens. Lara Croft paced the uneven ground of the suffering zone, her steps quick and purposeful. The mist swirled around her as she spoke, her tone sharp and clipped, though it softened at times. James Brown followed close behind, his intense gaze on her, his face a mixture of curiosity and respect. He listened without interrupting, letting her unravel her story.
I woke up this morning, James.
She began, her voice low but steady.
And I just hated everything.
She exhaled sharply, shaking her head.
But then I remembered a scar means I survived. That's what I've learned. Surviving is what I do.
James Brown nodded, his brow furrowing slightly.
Yeah, I get that. You gotta use what you gotta get what you want. That's survival.
Lara gave him a quick glance, a flicker of a smile crossing her lips.
Survival, yes. But
Her expression darkened as she continued.
at what cost? I was 9 when it all began. The plane crash. The Himalayas.
She gestured to the swirling mist, and scenes of snow and jagged mountains formed around them.
10 days in the wilderness alone. I thought I'd die out there. I thought, maybe I should.
James Brown whistled under his breath.
Ain't no kid supposed to go through that. You made it, though. That's strength.
Strength?
Lara turned to face him, her eyes flashing.
Strength is knowing the extraordinary isn't in who we are. It's in what we do. But sometimes I wish I didn't have to be so strong.
Her voice softened, and she looked away.
After that, I lost everything. My mother, my father, my family. They disowned me when I chose this path. Archaeology, adventure, nonsense, they called it. They wanted me to sit still, be proper, like a doll on a shelf.
James Brown let out a low laugh.
Ain't nothing proper about me either. And sitting still? That's a curse.
She gave a short, bitter laugh in return.
I suppose we're alike in that. But it doesn't end there, James. Every journey, every tomb, it's a test. Hostile environments, mercenaries, criminals, even things that shouldn't exist.
Her voice dropped, her tone almost haunted.
Mutants, undead, mythological creatures. They don't belong in this world, but I've faced them all. And every time, I wonder if I'll make it out alive.
Sounds like you hate those tombs.
James Brown said quietly. Her laugh was sharp this time.
I do. I hate them. But I can't seem to stop. Maybe it's because the past is gone and the future's uncertain. Or maybe it's because courage isn't the absence of fear, but triumph over it.
James Brown nodded again, his voice thoughtful now.
I hear you. Sometimes you struggle so hard to feed your body, you forget to feed your spirit. That's what I had to learn too.
Lara stopped pacing, her hands resting on her hips as she looked at him.
Spirit? Sometimes I think mine's already broken. The betrayals. People I trusted like Werner von Croy. And the losses, Amanda, others. They leave marks deeper than scars. And then there's the responsibility. Artifacts that could destroy the world. It's always on me to keep them out of the wrong hands.
James Brown tilted his head, his expression somber.
That's heavy, Lara. Real heavy. But let me tell you something. Music, it's like breath and it's life itself. Maybe your fight, your journey, that's your music.
Lara blinked, considering his words.
Maybe you're right. The extraordinary is in what we do, after all. And as much as I hate it, I can't walk away.
James Brown gave her a small, understanding smile.
You're still standing? That says enough.
Lara looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and defiance.
Yes,
She said softly.
I am.
She turned back to the path ahead, her steps steady now.
And I always will be.
James Brown followed her, the faintest trace of admiration in his eyes. Neither said another word as they moved forward, each carrying their scars and their strength in silence.